Okay, so welcome everyone to our session today, which depending on where you are in the world is a lunch and learn, or we can call it a show and tell, I suppose, if it's not lunchtime where you are. So the topic for today is Prune, Tune, Postpone, Explain, which is a framework to improve your form UX, which was devised by Caroline, one of our panelists today. In terms of the format today, Caroline will take you through this and then we'll have a group discussion. Feel free to put any observations or questions into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try and cover all of those if you don't mind. But yeah, so Caroline will present first, then we'll come on to that. In terms of who we've got today, we'll do a little quick intros, but we've got Orok and Caroline. Firstly, myself, I'm Managing Director of Zuko. Zuko are a form analytics software an optimizer provider, which enables you to gain research on your user experience in your online forms. I'll hand over to Orok now to give himself a quick intro.
Yeah, thanks. Hi everyone. Yeah, my name's Orok. I'm a UX researcher, previously been a UX designer, director of Orakoku Limited, which is giving research services to businesses. I currently work in the fintech industry, and I also teach with a company called Love Circular a few times a week, teaching students UX and UI design. I'll hand over to Caroline.
Oh, thanks very much. It's great to be here. I'm Caroline Jarrett. I've been unnaturally interested in making better forms for over 30 years now, an obsession that seems to have shown no signs of wearing off. So it's very much a privilege to be given a chance to talk about forms. So that's what I'm going to do. So let me just make sure it was working. There we go. So the Prune, Tune, Postpone, Explain, for me, this is 4 ways to make shorter, better forms. And I just thought I'd do a little bit of group participation, which is if you've ever thought I'd prefer a longer, more horrible form, I'll just get you to raise your hand. One hand, thank you very much, Ilyas. Let me have an explanation from you of why you think a longer, more horrible form would be a suitable thing to have. I'm just guessing that Ilyas may have been joking. So I'm going to move on and assume that the rest of us, and possibly Ilyas as well, all agree that shorter, better forms are something we aspire to. So my first suggestion is to prune your form. So the idea of pruning is to cut out anything that you don't really need and reduce the thing to its essentials. So the illustration is from gardening, where in many cases we need to prune back to let the plant grow better. In our case, we want to prune our form not so that it can grow back again, although inevitably a few questions get added back. It's much more so that we're not doing all the work as an organization to look after data that we don't really need, and we're not putting that burden onto our users. So the way I suggest that you might do that is by using a question protocol. So a question protocol is different from the form itself because it's about how you use the answers. And in your question protocol, you list every question that you ask, but then you look at who within the organization uses the answer to the question, what they use it for, and you generally have to find an actual individual who says, this is a decision I make based on that answer. And it's also helpful to think about whether an answer is required or optional. If it's required, what actually happens in the organization when someone just puts in any old thing to get through the form. So I won't hide it from you, question protocol is quite a boring thing to do, but it's also very necessary and will make that whole process of pruning back what you don't really need much easier. Trigger warning about content. This service was the child funeral service, but it's a very sensitively written blog post by Adam Silver, which gives an example of how he used a question protocol in practice in obviously quite a challenging form to design. So once you've got that protocol, there's something you can also do here, which is you've boiled it down to everything you need to know, but postpone gives you an opportunity to say, do we really need to know this straight away, or can we ask for this information as needed? Again, it's about just-in-time data rather than putting a large burden on people before they really need to have that level of conversation. the most classic example, I think, is many of us have been forced to go through quite lengthy and sometimes intrusive registration processes when all we wanted to do was some fairly trivial interaction. And so what people need for getting started and what they want to do today, and then ask them other things as needed, will create, again, less data handling for you, better quality of data, and less burden on your users. Once we've decided we really do need to ask a particular question, then tuning is about making questions easier to answer. So easier to actually, the interaction of giving your answer, easier to find an answer, to discover what answer you want to give, and also easier to understand why you have to answer. And my husband spotted this example of a form which was a bit problematic to answer in the real world. This is actually, he's been asked to enter his date of birth, and in fact he's just coming up for his 70th birthday, and being an engineer he calculated that he was going to have to hit the back button 840 times on this particular form, which did not make him happy. So that could have been made easier for him. Sometimes these tuning problems are a bit more subtle. There's recently been a form that's been actually remarkably popular for a government form in the United States. I'm afraid the link is only available in the US, but an American friend of mine kindly sent me a PDF of the form. And it's about applying to get relief from your student loans. And although it's been very well received, people did ask, why have I got to type my name in twice? On the left, you see at the beginning of the form, and then later on you do it again. What you're not seeing here is the context, which is that the second time it asks for a name is about part of the declaration or signing ceremony. But because the format looks exactly the same, people didn't really notice the surrounding context. So a little bit of tuning up of the way that question has been asked might have helped to reveal the reason for it. And so that brings us to explain. So explaining is about saying why this question is important. I think of it as in the middle of the interaction design on the left and the reason why people are doing it, service design on the right. It's often that we don't give sufficient consideration to the actual content design or conversation of our forms. And sometimes a little bit of explanation, which is actually a few more words, can really help. I often say, well, people never click on the word help or the little question mark, but they will click on a link that says, what's this? Or where can I find this? Or why are we asking this? That extra context can help them through. So we've ended up with a four-way framework of pruning, which is getting rid of questions you don't need at all, and then tuning, making questions easier to interact with an answer. A sort of subset of pruning is postponing questions, and then explaining is saying why you need the answer, which is a sort of subset of tune. And I think of them as prune and tune just because it's more harmonious. So that was my idea. And I'm so delighted that Orok could join us on the call, because I'd like now to say to Orok, I've given you a thing that I think works. And I'd particularly like to know whether you think in a practical level that would actually work from your practice and what you hear from your students.
Yeah, cheers, Caroline. I found this quite interesting because it's not something I've personally delved into as specifically form optimization, but the process is super similar to how research is approached and how UX is approached. You know, we look at why we're doing what we're doing, the benefits it gives to the user and the business. We make things easy, we get rid of the bits we don't, and we make it super efficient. So, you know, one thing I teach to students on sort of a weekly basis is one side of UX that's quite difficult is the soft skills. So when you're talking to a business and trying to translate how this benefits the business and how we implement it, is there a thing that you've done in the past, is it in a past experience where you found you can get this to land over other project things that are happening, because we have sort of 8 other people from 8 other departments all sort of wrestling for, you know, my part of the work is really important. How do you make this sort of more digestible? Because I'd say there's an example I've got of when I presented a framework that's very similar for research. This is how we approach this, what we do, here's all the benefits. And often it can like fall on deaf ears sometimes. So like the practicality of implementing stuff and battling with senior leaders, memberships, and other people in the business, how have you found that in the past?
I have to say that I hear your pain and a similar struggle. Getting people to really want to pay attention to user experience altogether can be a battle in some organizations. And getting people to pay attention to forms, in my experience, is even bigger battle. So I've genuinely worked in situations where people were more willing and more excited about using artificial intelligence and robotic process automation to deal with excess data on forms that they were collecting unnecessarily than to do the work of asking the question, why are we getting these forms in at all? Do we really need them? Could we make them simpler so we don't have to employ a robot or AI? So really challenging an organization to think about the answers is a more difficult ask than saying, let's spend a load of money on technology. So I think that's a really important practical matter. But once you can get people to start even try a little bit about making those forms easier, the paybacks can be stunning. If you can improve your conversion rate a little bit, you can suddenly see all sorts of benefits coming in terms of higher sales, higher happiness of your customers, less expense of the people on the helpline trying to sort out difficulties and so on. The less that you're asking customers to do for what they need to do, the more likely you're actually going to get them engaged and working with you and happy. I guess that's sort of Alan has a point or two on that topic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have similar experiences. Obviously, we just do forms, so trying to get attention. Once you can get the attention of the UX person, but then pushing it further. Obviously, we have the benefit that we can trial our software for free, get a benchmark, and then you can apply. Okay, if you in theory improve your conversion rate by 5%, you can basically quantify that. And that can help. We found it, particularly if you've got a very business focus, if the UX person is fighting for, like you say, amongst 8 different projects, it can be very useful to do that. So that would always try and quantify where possible. In terms of the framework itself, there's obviously lots of points there, and there's some interesting points because obviously, in this business, we know nothing is ever absolute, and you need to change. I mean, one thing that I always think about when, for example, the prune phase, obviously in general, getting rid of questions you don't need is good, but obviously there are cases that we've come across, and I'll drop a quick case study link in the chat as well, of a case by Michael Agard where actually you reduce the number of form fields and actually reduces your conversion rate, because what you're doing is changing the expectations of the user. Sometimes, for instance, in financial services, a user would expect to be asked certain things. If you're applying for a mortgage, you'd expect to be asked financial questions, and if you're not being asked them, you might get suspicious, especially if the brand is not not a big one. And I think also in the case study I'm going to share, it was more about it was a lead generation form, and they asked more questions and they got a higher conversion rate, perhaps because they thought the people were going to get a more tailored response, because they were asking very specific questions of what type of business are you, that sort of thing. So again, that's a hypothesis, but I say I'll share the link. But I don't know what you guys think about particularly that prune phase. I mean, where's the line drawn when you're pulling stuff out? Do you need to obviously, I guess you need to test, but obviously there's the user to take into account as well as the internal needs of the organization.
I'll get Orok to go first on that one, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. It's funny you say that, because an example I give quite regularly to students I teach and use in my own work is a similar context, but not at the same time, is click rate. People think that a lot of clicks is a bad user experience, when in reality, a bad user experience is clicks that don't do what you need, what you expect. there's the Jacob's Law, which is Jakob Nielsen, who states that people expect certain things in the same industries to do what they are used to. If you get a new iPhone, you expect it to be like the last iPhone. It's an expectation. We don't like change. The government, gov.uk, when they did a big redesign of their flows and forms, they used to have one huge form. It didn't get used a lot when they were trying to digitize. And one thing they did was strip everything back. So they pruned really well. But they then implemented a longer process. So there was more questions, but they were categorized in a way that made sense to the user. And it actually proved really successful. And now when you use anything on the gov.uk website, you'll probably notice it'll ask you one thing at a time. Enter your date of birth, next. Enter your name, next. Enter this, next. And it actually like quadrupled the amount of clicks, but made it contextual and people actually used it and it made sense. So I think, like you say, it's a really good point of where is that fine line? And how do you feel about that, Caroline, like in terms of sometimes getting rid of things might change that, and how do you find that balance?
Yeah, and I think that generally you need to, obviously, one of the things that I think I will definitely after this seminar add to this slide, and thank you very much for bringing that to my attention, is the test it step. I've sort of assumed that we're going to do lots of user research to actually find out what users really think. So having made some decisions about what we think we can get rid of, going back to users and saying what do they expect? One of the most powerful techniques, I think, in testing forms is before we go to the next page is to ask the person, what do you think it's going to ask you next? So a classic example for me would be something like a shipping address. There's nothing wrong with asking someone what their shipping address would be, but typically it's better to ask that at the point where they're already committed to purchasing something, rather than saying, before you browse this site, please give me your shipping address. It seems too early, and it might even be completely unnecessary in the case of an electronic product, perhaps, that's being delivered by email. Like, well, why did you need the shipping address at all? So it's generally the case that you've got to always do some testing, as you said, or the other thing is that I would say that in my experience, forms, particularly government forms, tend to have too much stuff that they've accreted over the years rather than too little. So the requirement for adding fields to forms is pretty unusual, but it's always useful for Alan to remind us that you can't just make a sweeping assessment and make it work all the time. You've got to be thoughtful about it all the way through, and that's what makes this sort of work more interesting, is say, yeah, but what about in my circumstances? And then I think, yeah, you got a point. I learn from doing this stuff as well as teaching it. But the one thing per page thing really came about because Tim Paul, who's head of the government digital service design system team these days, he and I were working together and doing a lot of form reviews. And we kept noticing that pages were coming at users with far too much stuff on them. So we started to say it's become design with only one thing per page, which is a slight misunderstanding. Where it's meant to be is really start with one thing per page when you have all your questions. So it's sort of the next step. Once you've got all the questions you want to ask, think about the design in terms of put one thing on each page, start your prototyping with that, and then test it with your users to see whether it does make more sense to combine them. For example, I've known some people be quite surprised if the username and password exchange is split across 2 pages. They would prefer to put their username and password in on the same page. Or another one might be that, again, coming back to address, we tend to expect that the form asks for all the fields of the address on one page. So you can let your user research then drive you back to how to combine questions into a flow, rather than putting everything at people strictly as one question on a page. or strictly as one massive form. So I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but I guess we ought to make sure that we give an opportunity to anyone who had a question or comment that they wanted to make. I think, Alan, you asked for them to go into the chat.
Yeah, there's some in the Q&A though. So Craig made a lot of points, so some of them around the Prune side. So I'm not going to read them all out. You can go in the Q&A there, but obviously thanks Craig for the shout out to run Zuko and A/B test. Always appreciated. So we have a few questions come in. First one is, well, actually, Ilias did actually come in, has actually responded and said, I wasn't joking about longer forms, Caroline. I prefer them to badly designed ones, as I get frustrated and end up giving more answers that I have given less thought to just move on. So that's the answer to the question.
Oh, and can I just say thank you, Ilias, for that clarification. And I think that really goes back to Orok's point as well, which is a longer, better design form. I would very much agree with that point. A longer, clearer, better design form definitely beats a shorter, more confusing one. Yeah, so thanks for making the point.
Yeah. So a couple of other questions. So Aman said, what kind of experience should we create in forms if nest field depends on the previous field? And this nesting will go on 4 or 5 steps max. So I guess that's conditional fields, I suppose, or conditional questions within the form.
Definitely. It's really challenging because a lot of the government forms, I mean, my world tends to be very complicated government forms, which are huge amounts of nesting and so on. And that was another reason why Tim and I ended up really pushing towards start your prototyping with one thing per page, because if you're doing a conditional thing where you've got one question and then it could go in a couple of different directions and then another couple of different directions, if you can just put each step in that conversation on its own page, then it's much more flexible in terms of how you take users through it, and they may not even realize they're on a longer path or a shorter path depending on their previous answer. Where it can get extremely complicated is where you're trying to put everything on a single page and you've got sort of questions expanding and expanding and expanding depending on a previous answer. That can become visually very technical for the user to understand. It can create quite a few accessibility problems into what the screen readers actually say, or if someone has some attention issues, whether they're actually following that thing unfolding. So this was another reason why we started to really recommend that people start their prototyping with one thing per page. It helps with these complex forms as well. So I hope that got somewhere near answering that question.
Cool. Yeah, and sort of another question from David. Effort justification bias comes into play here, particularly with onboarding processes. The more effort you put in, the more likely you'll surrender your email address. What's your view on this in regard to the framework? Sometimes more is better than less. So I guess that's like the sunk costs fallacy. If people have spent time giving you information, or the principle of completion, they want to complete. Do you have thoughts on either of you on that in terms of form design?
I guess I'd like to hear from Orok first on that one, and then I'll chip in.
Yeah, I was reading that just a moment ago, and I think that there's a lot to consider there in terms of friction in a form. So I think that sometimes friction is quite a good thing. Getting the user to stop and think is really important, and I think it's come back to one of the points that you made earlier about people skipping through and just filling forms in. If a lot of effort goes in, you are more. I've been, personal experience. I've completed a form, and it's gone both ways. I've put a lot of effort in, and then I've got really annoyed that I've not got the outcome I expected, and I've left it, and I've gone, this is a nightmare. That's bad UX, as we all know. But then, on the flip side of that, there's times where I feel like it gets better each time, and it's like, okay, yeah, it's asking me, this is what I'm expecting, this is what it's meant to do. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll give it my email address, even though I know I'm going to get loads of marketing emails. It's sort of a trade-off that you give that's worthwhile. So I struggle with the balance on that, and you have to go real deep into the research of what it is you're trying to do. And I guess a lot of these are context specific, aren't they? In one industry, it'll be completely different. If you're trying to sort of gather information for something quite short and sweet, then it changes that context as to whether you're then doing something like asking for money in the next step, in which case it becomes more personal. But that's my thought on it, and I think the context changes that for me.
Yeah, and I think I'd really like to pick up on that. The context is everything. My context, as I said, is typically government forms where there's no choice. You either deal with the government or you don't, and generally you have to. And so people tend to be approaching those forms with a certain level of cognitive deficit anyway, because it's quite stressful dealing with government by and large. And so we're trying all the time to make it as simple and straightforward as possible, because it's an intrinsically quite stressful and difficult process because it's government, even if it's genuinely easy. In other circumstances, let's say, for example, I used to do a lot of work with the Open University where we might be selling an MBA course, which is going to basically take away 3 to 8 years of your life. Maybe a little bit of difficulty in the form process might be helpful there or might not. But I think really what comes back to about it is thoughtfulness here. And so what we want to do is, if we are going to create a more committed process for users, it should be because we've really established that that's the best way to approach it with plenty of user research. It shouldn't be accidental because we accidentally ask them for a bunch of stuff we don't really need and they don't really want to tell us. So I guess the underlying message there is about really understanding the context, as Oric said, and then being very thoughtful about, if you do place barriers in people's way, is that because you genuinely believe that barrier is helpful to them? Or is it something you're doing accidentally that might trip them up?
I think that makes sense, and Craig makes a good point in the Q&A that it's motivation versus friction and effort. So high motivation, or whether that's voluntary or compelled in the case of your government forms, they'll probably continue despite the friction. I suppose the balancing act comes in, okay, if they don't have high motivation, whether it's medium or low, do you want to try and suck them in by giving them more questions? And I think the answer, as it always comes down to, is to test it. Is that going to work or not? So we do have another question from Ilyas, who says, do people trust messages at the start of forms where it says something like, this will take 5 minutes? Is this tested before or after? Now, obviously, in theory, it should be tested, but I don't know if you've got any real life experiences of doing anything like that, or taking it more broadly, managing expectations in general, telling people, okay, that you need your passport number, or giving them something at the start rather than just letting them dive in and then realize how long it's going to take or how much information they're going to need to provide.
I can go first again if you want.
Sure.
I think that transparency is key in a lot of UX principles and approaches. Transparency, again, in context. If you are transparent about what's about to come up front, and that's usually based on some information you already have. So a lot of software that I've used in the past will calculate how long these forms will take and give you an approximation. So if you use something like SurveyMonkey or something like that, if you're going to do that, it usually calculates and tells you, based on the questions you put in, this will take 2 to 3 minutes. What I tend to do as a researcher is I will do a very short internal test on that and make sure it actually does make sense, because there's nothing worse than sending an email out saying, can you take this quick survey? It should only take a minute of your time. And then you have a really confusing question in there that people have to sit and think about for 3 minutes. So they can do it in 2 minutes, but it might actually take you 5 or 10. So I always test it myself. Again, comes back to testing. I'll go through it. Does this make sense? I'll do the mum test. I'll send it to my mum. Does this make sense, mum? Because she has no idea what I do. So it's sort of, how long did it take you to do? And then you usually get the analytics as well in those tools, and it tells you how many people have completed it, how long it took. I tend to test that before it goes out and make sure that if that expectation is set, then that's what they're going to get. And then that transparency at the beginning, you're going to need this, you're going to need that, and it is going to take this long. And I've tested it. I can be confident that, you know, my experience in building trust with people is about being transparent and upfront. And it's not very often you'll get feedback saying, I didn't like that survey. It's very hard to do a survey on a survey. So it's a tough one to approach unless you want to send another survey. How was that survey? And in which case it's going to be negative instantly, because how many surveys do we actually fill out of the ones we get sent? It's quite low. So yeah, that's my take on it, is test before it goes out, confirm all those things, and be super transparent.
So I guess that I would absolutely endorse the test. And the one thing that, test it with typical people from your target audience. If that includes your mum, that's great. And if it doesn't, then find somebody who is part of the people that you want to fill in. But I would also say, just beware of your analytics, beware about your ranges and your averages. So if you're looking at an arithmetic average, that might be made up of 20 people who took a minute and one person who took half an hour. And that person who took half an hour might be someone with a disability, or someone with a cognitive impairment, or someone who might feel bad about it. So just look at your range and think about whether someone who is in a difficult circumstance or has some kind of disability might take longer, in which case you want to frame that time very carefully. Or if it's really short, maybe think about not telling them. It's more like, sometimes for the sort of forms I do, it might be worth occasionally warning people, this will probably take you a couple of hours, pack a lunch, that kind of thing. Which, talking of lunch, I think, Alan, I'm afraid we're out of time, aren't we?
We're out of time. So I know we could talk about forms all day because we love it. But if there's any last minute questions, drop them in there. I guess I just made one last point on the framework. It always intrigues me that the second point, the tune point, because I guess to me, this is the most difficult one, because how do you make questions easier to interact with? What's the issue? So I think it's always important to diagnose the issue. And ideally for that, you need data. So where are the friction points in your form? If you can ideally use that, it allows you to focus in on where the biggest issues are, and then you can create the hypotheses on how to improve it. Just a shameless plug, we do have an ebook which talks a lot about the potential issues you might have and gives lots of ideas for these hypotheses. So I will share that when we share the recording as well, because it's worth looking at. But I don't know if you have any other thoughts on how you get to how do you do the tune piece? Is there any process for that part of the process?
Can we do that in another seminar? Because I think we've run out of time.
I guess that's
I think, get a content designer, get an interaction designer, watch people in your user research, as Oric has suggested, and I've heartily endorsed. When you actually watch people filling in your form, you'll get no end of ideas from them. They may tell you, but more importantly, just simply watching people work on the questions will pop ideas into your head. Generally, the results of usability testing on a form tend to be more things than you have time to deal with, rather than a lack of ideas about what to do. Yeah.